Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. One of the most popular interviews we've had on this podcast was with one of Canada's most popular big thinkers, science fiction writer Rob Sawyer. No surprise. His writing has captured the imagination of people who've pondered other worlds and other futures. He's the only Canadian to have won all three top awards in science fiction, the Nebula, the Hugo, and the John W. Campbell Memorial Award. I spoke with Rob a year ago. I'm not sure if you caught that conversation, worth a revisit if you did catch it. And the pandemic was still raging around the globe. And I asked him at that time to envision our future, even a post-pandemic one. I asked Rob back today to see whether his predictions held true and what his thoughts are for 2023 and beyond. Hello, Rob. Nice to have you back.
It's wonderful to be here, Mary. We survived a year of this at least.
We did. So I want to start off with that and ask you, how was 2022 for you compared to 2021?
You know, this year, as we're recording this, is almost over, and it seemed to zip by in a way that 2021 did not. 2021 crawled for me, and I think a large part of that was dealing with this sea change in our lives, right, of COVID and locking down and so forth, even though we didn't start until March of last year, doing any kind of precautions. But now that it's become the new normal, it's not impinging on my consciousness, or I think a lot of other people's consciousness, nearly as much. That's not necessarily a good thing because we are not over it. But 2022 zipped by for me.
Okay, yeah. So I'd like to take us back to that conversation that we had about a year ago. And at that time, Omicron was spreading across the globe. Public restrictions were still in place. And I asked you at that time whether you thought Omicron was a game changer. And you said no, you felt that mutations were actually the game changer and that the virus would eventually become something like the flu. Now, I don't know if we're exactly in that scenario yet. Like, what are your thoughts about your comments back then?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Omicron was a variant, and there have been more variants since. We used to have, the single COVID vaccination. Now it's the bivalent booster shot for that. Ironically, as we speak this week, there's been a lot of news about a potential flu shot that covers a whole range of strains. Instead of the traditional flu shot means that, here in Canada, Health Canada in the States, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention try to predict months in advance, because there's a manufacturing lag, months in advance what is going to be the prevalent strain of flu. And, 7 times out of 10, they guess right, and the flu shot is very effective. 3 times out of 10, they guess poorly, and people get a lot of flu. We're now possibly looking at, this is really cutting edge stuff, an inoculation against the flu that will inoculate you regardless of what strain comes to be dominant. And if we can get something like that, if it works for the flu, which is a virus, right? A variety of viruses with various mutations, we may be able to get that with COVID, so that we're not saying, okay, we're trying to fight Omicron right now. We're trying to fight this. We're trying to fight that. It's going to be a fact of life. The flu for a long time and COVID for a long time to come still. So any progress we make in making sure people are protected is all to the good.
Yeah. So you say still a long time to come. I don't know if it's my imagination, but I don't think I hear the word post-pandemic as much as I did when this first started. Do you feel that too? And it's funny too, because in that interview, you actually said, post-pandemic is an aspirational term. It's kind of like post-holiday weight loss, something you'd like to happen, but we don't really know if it's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that observation you made is absolutely spot on. You don't hear people talking about it as something we're going to get over, the pandemic, the post-pandemic phrase. And you're absolutely right. I think the zeitgeist has changed in a way that is permanent. People have come to accept that this viral infection or a similar airborne respiratory viral infection will be part of the background of our lives for the foreseeable future until we finally come up with some kind of new genetic cure that knocks out all viruses.
Yeah, but we're out of pretty much all restrictions at this point. And I guess I'm wondering, what's the spillover? I think a lot of us during the pandemic, when we weren't able to socialize, some of that just kind of carried on. We became comfortable being at home. Oh, it's such a big effort going out and, meeting certain people. And so I'm wondering, did those people, and I'm not talking about close family and really close friends, but maybe the people on the periphery, did they just kind of fall to the wayside because now we can't be bothered? I sort of
Yes.
wondered about that, with the effect on our social relationships.
Just before we started recording this, I got an email from a friend saying that she and her friend would like to see me for a meal, before the holidays. And, will I find time in my schedule? And I thought, oh man, it already is winter here in Canada. I don't really want to go out. I've got a nice big screen TV. I've got books to read. So yeah, we did triage in our lives on our social relationships over the last more than a year and a half now of this. And some of them, uh, Christmas get-togethers. I had lunch with my brother today, close family member, right?
Yeah.
Some of that stuff, that's really, we realize is really important, and we don't let it fall by the wayside. And others of it that we just used to do because that's what people used to do,
Hmm.
has lost its inertia. You'll think that I eat out all the time, but I was eating out on Friday of last week. Right across the street from me, there's a restaurant pub kind of thing. And I was eating there with a friend, but it was deserted. Now, I remember pre-pandemic, Friday after work, everybody would go to a pub, right? And this one would
Yeah.
be hopping, right?
Yeah.
And now, after work, if you're working at home, of course, you don't make the effort to go out. And if you're working at the office, you think, I'll see them tomorrow at the office. So you don't build your social life necessarily around it. So it has been a real change in the way human beings have behaved.
You know what? I can't help but think that's detrimental because, well, in many different ways, but I'll just
Yeah.
mention one. And I don't know if serendipity would come into this, but so often I find that I'll be in a social situation with many people, and we don't have those kind of situations, a lot of them now, right? Where there's a lot of people and you're meeting them. I mean, they're just starting. But I might accidentally just meet someone. I don't know them, but I find we get into a really interesting conversation. And of course, that wouldn't have happened. And, you can meet these people who you normally wouldn't meet, and they might think very differently from you. So now you're open to a whole different way of thinking, their way of thinking that you wouldn't be exposed to. And so my concern is when your world becomes so small and you're probably going to gravitate towards people who are like-minded, who think like you, like in a larger way, isn't that dangerous?
100% it's dangerous. Absolutely. We talk about information silos and echo chambers, right? In terms of what you hear about politics, what you hear about social issues, what kind of economic advice you get is EFTs. Everybody, if you were in the right place at the
Mm,
right time, people were telling you EFTs or cryptocurrency was the way to go. And then guess what? If you had a broader swath of input, you would hear EFTs. That's a fad. That ain't going to last. Cryptocurrency, they're very fragile, these exchanges and so forth. If there's a software glitch, all your money's gone, and it's not FDA, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, I should say, protected and all. You don't get that information. And serendipity is such a fabulous word because so many of the people that have been important to me and the only new friends that I made in 2022, this year, were serendipitous encounters. And a
oh,
couple of them have become
interesting.
very good, very close friends. But they were in person, face to face encounters. And that just doesn't happen in the online world. And it certainly doesn't happen if you're not interacting with other human beings at all.
Okay, so there is a researcher. I did interview her, and she's doing work on serendipity. And she said she was fearful about this, not just from a social aspect. I mean, she even talked about you go and travel, and when you go somewhere, there's all kinds of openings for serendipitous encounters, right? When you travel, new place, new land, you stumble across something. But she was even saying regarding research and knowledge, because if you go, let's say, to a library, you're physically actually there, you're not online. You may go for a certain book, but then your eyes cast over, oh, the book beside it, or the book in the next shelf, and then you find like, well, I'm interested in this too, and isn't this like curious? And so it opens up all these other possibilities that normally you may not, if you're so goal oriented online that's what you're going to go for.
100%. I absolutely agree with that. In fact, browsing, whether just leafing through a physical text, that chapter's not interesting, this one is, or as you say, looking at bookshelves, is very different than the way search is conducted online. We now ask for a very specific thing,
Yeah.
and we pick, you'll be shown 10 hits by Google, but you normally pick one of the first three. So there's very little serendipity in finding things and discovering things.
So I remember one researcher said to me that one of the fundamental, I don't know what you call it, truths, I guess, about humans and their happiness is that we need to connect to others. Now, he didn't specify how we connect to others. He just said we need to connect to others. Do you think that we would be just as happy if a lot of our social connections and relationships were virtual? Do you think we can be just as happy?
That's a really good question, because a virtual social relationship can either be asynchronous, that is, I send you an email or I send a text, or synchronous, that is, we're both doing video simultaneously. Now, you can chat by text, but you can also send a text and hours later the other person
Yeah.
replies, right? So there's asynchronous and there's synchronous. In the real world, there's only one kind of interactivity, the synchronous kind, where you're sitting down over coffee or you're talking, to the person sitting next to you on the subway or whatever it is, right? Or a coworker. So this whole kind of interactivity that is the hallmark of a lot of virtual interactivity really is serial communication, right? It's asynchronous,
Mm-hmm.
one after another. And that's not anything that the human animal ever evolved to cherish or deal with. I know people who have gotten married over long distance relationships and so forth, that it's possible, to fall in love and have a relationship over uh, Zoom or some other video form. But even there's a degree of planning, right?
Yeah.
Whereas you just run into your friend, I live in a condominium apartment building. My friend Sebastian lives down the hallway. I go down the hallway all the time, and every once in a while I run into Sebastian. We have a little interactivity, right? Nice guy. We chat a little bit, and that doesn't happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not just sitting here with my video camera on, hoping that somebody will come on at the other end. I say, okay, let's do a video at 7:30 p.m. tonight, and it
Yeah.
changes the whole nature of that communication
Mm-hmm.
into a way that is very much unlike what was the traditional form of interacting with human beings right from the dawn of Homo sapiens,
Yeah.
200,000 years ago.
Mm. You know, One of the other really interesting areas that we talked about, you said that increasing attention to movements like Black Lives Matter,
Yes.
Me Too, and other groups who were seeking, equality, justice, that was related to the pandemic and its disruption to society as a whole.
It's not the pandemic per se, it's not a disease that has done this, but it's a worldwide disruption of the status quo. World
Hmm.
War II was much the same thing. And as an example from World War II, that's when women in large numbers entered the workforce, and in particularly in non-traditional female occupations, because the men were overseas fighting this stupid but in that case, possibly necessary war. Um, this is very similar. It's everybody understands it's in the air that there's going to be a reset switch hit if it hasn't been already. So if whatever your agenda might be, pro or con, or good or bad, this is the opportunity to seize the moment. On the good side, we had Black Lives Matter. We had Me Too. We had an enormous awareness of a lot of problems. On the bad side, uh, white supremacy has taken much more bandwidth of the human race than it has for a long time. These people who have been crepuscular creatures lurking in the shadows, with their tiny little groups, are saying, okay, who knows what the new world order is going to be, but I think it should be with me on top, right?
Hmm.
So all of these groups, some that we would consider, yay, about time, right? We shouldn't have had to have a Black Lives Matter movement in the 21st century, right? We should have had it in the 18th century, when the Emancipation Proclamation went down to the United States. But we are getting it, and it's positive, and there's no question about that. But there's also this very negative stuff that people are also saying it's going to be a whole new world. Let's change it.
Yeah. You know what? Yeah, it's interesting. You're right. You bring up the sort of the good and the bad. What about with AI? Well, I find a lot of it scary, especially when I think, what kind of oversight is there going on, right? Well, how is this election interference happening, and what about this hacking, of personal
Yeah, this
information
scares
into
me a
these
great
large
deal. This
companies?
is
I
the
mean,
part to
what
be
about
concerned
that?
about, is that artificial intelligence has the potential, we science fiction writers write about this all the time, of supplanting humanity, right? And yet it's not being created in a public space where we can observe, comment, and regulate what's going on. Instead, it's being created by big private corporations where all of the work is trade secrets. All of the employees are under non disclosure agreements, and we really don't know what's going on, how sophisticated or not sophisticated it is. We have, Google's assurance and Amazon's assurance that their home assistants aren't listening all the time. Do we really know that? How do we audit that, except that they say that they aren't listening all the time? So it's very scary stuff in terms of that. And the military, of course, people somehow have missed the point. They talk about how, someday we might have to watch out for Terminators that will kill human beings, right? Like the robots in the James Cameron movies. We're using AI controlled drones to kill people in combat zones right now. We already have people who have died at the hands of robots and artificial intelligence. And most of that, some of the robotic stuff has happened in industry, but most of it has happened under the guise of the military, which has very, very little oversight over what they actually do, public oversight over what they actually do. Uh, it's something we all should be very worried about.
Yeah, I mean, because we don't know. Well, we don't know what we don't know, do we? Because I was going
That's
to
right.
ask you, well, who's leading this game? I mean, is it the Googles and or is it the military, or like who's out in front with the technology? But we don't know.
Well, and in some sense, we should hope that it's Google and the military as opposed to our enemies, as opposed to, not that those guys aren't necessarily our enemies some of the time. You may
Yeah.
recall that when Google started, it had a slogan, which was "Don't be evil." And they dispensed with that slogan, right? It's no longer their
I don't even
slogan.
remember that.
Yeah, don't be
Okay, don't be
evil when they
evil.
started,
Mm.
because they knew they were going to have enormous power. And now they're evil a fair bit of the time. Um, we, you know, Russia, which is an enemy of the NATO nations right now, and we are a NATO nation, uh, is as good technologically at most things as we are in the West. China, which is, of course, using AI in a great deal to reinforce what is usually perceived as a quite repressive regime there. Uh, if those technologies are being used domestically by countries that we happen to be opposed to, in some small sense, it's none of our damn business. But when Russia is hacking our election systems, when China is
Hmm.
having these offices, as they have here in Canada and other countries, that keep track of Chinese born people abroad, that's quite invasive and is happening with really out any pushback from, our Foreign Affairs Department and the American Secretary of State and so forth. It's just going on. And yet it's clearly the frontier and will soon be the majority part of how we interact with our enemies. That's going to be through their use of artificial intelligence and computing technology against us.
So, I mean, what are we supposed to do? It is all so covert.
It is. And it's a really difficult question as to what we're going to do. And I wish I had a definitive answer, because the scenarios in science fiction are all plausible that we may be subjugated by the AIs themselves, or we may simply be subjugated by whichever world power, including, we've come very close to having an autocratic United States government recently, and it might very well happen again in the near future. So including even what we used to perceive of as a friendly power, wielding these technologies in a way that simply obviates our personal freedom. What I would like to see is any company that is doing artificial intelligence research has to do it under what's called free and open source software. That's the way a lot of the tools that people use. If you don't use Microsoft Office, you probably use OpenOffice or LibreOffice or one of the various free versions that have been made by programmers who say, we can do this too. And you can look at the code. You can see that there's no tracking in this. You can see, and if there's a bug, not just the maker, but everybody who uses it, I think I see what you did wrong here. Oh yeah, dumb me, I can fix that, or you can fix that. I'll incorporate your code. And because there's so many, not just billions, but trillions of dollars at stake in the artificial intelligence marketplace, it's very unlikely that we'll ever get that. But honestly, I think that's the only answer, that if you have something that you claim is an algorithm or an AI program that's doing something, it should be examinable. The EU has been doing some very interesting work in this. They have required that algorithms be explainable and auditable, because most algorithms work by machine learning. And that is a black box. You just put in tons of data and you keep running scenarios, and whatever the output is, if you get the output that you're hoping for, then you say, okay, it's found the solution. But there's no way of looking at what the steps are that have been done in between. And, famously, people of color are discriminated against in bank loans, for instance. And algorithms are used to establish who's eligible for a bank loan. Well, of course, it was said, and quite rightly, the bank said, okay, well, we won't use race. We used to use it. Mea culpa, our bad. We used to use it. We won't use it anymore. But we still want, to get our bank loans to go to people who are actually going to repay them. Well, what happened is that it turned out that a lot of banks were using algorithms that found another way to identify race without using your race. And that turned out to be zip codes in the United States, that where you lived would be very much, because the United States is still dealing with a lot of segregation, both on an economic and on an ethnic, a racial basis, that, okay, these zip codes have a tendency to have people who default on loans. And it happens that they also have a very high percentage of people. But the proxy is invisible unless somebody really does a deep dive forensic audit. And those are very difficult to do, of these algorithms, to figure out, why is it consistently turning down black applicants? Because we didn't plug all the holes, and the AI has no idea what it's doing. We call it artificial intelligence, but it's as dumb as a post. It doesn't know what it's doing. It just knows that you, being the banker or the lender or whoever it is, liked the output that I gave or disliked the output, and it adjusts accordingly.
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's insidious and it's so complex and it just gets so buried. And
Yes.
the average person, I mean, we don't even understand. As you say, it's just this black box. Who can figure it out unless you're an expert in this area?
That's right. And, we have uh, something that we value greatly, which is democracy. And in a democracy, we have all sorts of people who are in Canada, members of parliament and senators, the United States senators, members of Congress, other places, similar roles, who are very often lawyers, sometimes business people, almost never ethicists or people who have real technological savvy. In fact, almost all of these people will say, oh yeah, my parliamentary aide or somebody in the IT department looks after that for me. Our policymakers, the people who should be the watchdogs and are the watchdogs over, drug regulation and transportation regulation, are so sadly out of touch with the actual forces that are remaking society, that we're not getting the leadership and oversight that we should be getting.
Do you know, it makes me think too, because you were talking about whether we're going to be in a bad situation. And I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, whether it's AI itself or some dominating power that is going to
It could be
subjugate
either.
us. Well, okay. So I'm trying to remember which book it was. I think it was your trilogy. I think it was Watch, where
Yes.
the internet develops straight human
Yes.
consciousness, right?
Wake,
That was in
Watch, and
Watch.
Wonder, my WWW
Right. Wake,
trilogy.
Watch. Yeah. So do you think that's possible?
I do think it's possible. And it's very simple, my argument. We are the most conscious things we know of in the universe. We evolved from much simpler life forms. Clearly, those very basic life forms weren't conscious in any kind of sense of having an inner life and reflectivity and a nagging voice, that said, oh, maybe that's not a good idea. All the things we associate with consciousness. Somewhere along the line, in the evolution of human beings from the original, not even unicellular life form, but more like viral-like pseudo life form, to us, consciousness emerged. And the argument that's almost always used in cognitive neuroscience is that it emerged when our brains became sufficiently complex, and it's what they call an epiphenomenon. An epiphenomenon is something you just get without planning for it. So foam on waves is the classic example. Waves make sense. Most of them are caused by the tides or by wind, but foam is just something that happens, right? You didn't plan for it. It doesn't serve any purpose. It just happens. And consciousness seemed to emerge in us, or maybe our immediate, or maybe even 3 or 4 level back ancestors, at the point at which the number of interconnections, the number of synapses in their brains reached a critical mass. Well, right now we don't have any computers that have a critical mass of computational bits that equal those in the human brain. I posited in Wake, Watch, and Wonder, those 3 novels, that the World Wide Web, that hyperlinks are very similar to synapses in the human brain. And part of the problem is we don't know how many synapses are on the human brain. It's really hard to count them.
Mm-hmm.
So we either recently passed, are right at, or are about to pass, equaling the number of hyperlinks on the World Wide Web as there are synapses in a single human brain. At some point, consciousness emerged previously when that happened biologically. There certainly is an argument to be made that they call it substrate independent, meaning it doesn't have to be in carbon biology, could be in silicon chips, that the same level of complexity will give rise to this epiphenomenon of saying, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? Who are you? Why am I here? Right? Which is what consciousness is.
So you obviously don't subscribe to the carbon biology path. You don't believe that we need that. It can be.
I don't think that we have. My mother was a statistician, and she would say you can't extrapolate any trend from one data point. The only data point we have of consciousness is carbon-based consciousness. It's the only one we know of.
Yeah.
So you can argue it two ways. One way is, and therefore, carbon must be the sine qua non, as they say. You have to have it or you don't have consciousness. Or you can argue it another way. Maybe anything would work, right? Anything that allows complexity.
Yeah.
That allows complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So carbon, carbon and silicon are right one above the other in the periodic table, which is why they have very similar chemical reactivity. Maybe silicon works just as well. Maybe you'll get life forms that are like the Horta on Star Trek, which was a living rock life form. Maybe. Or maybe our computers will do this. We just don't know. We don't have enough information. And in the lack of information, this is where caution and why science fiction is really the literature of cautionary tales that say, we don't know for sure that this isn't possible. And we have some decent arguments for why it might be possible. So we should be on guard against something other than carbon consciousness. And I don't mean in terms of carbon sequestration and, climate change, that something that
Mm-hmm.
isn't a biological life form might emerge and have its own ideas, its own agendas, and its own sense of ethics that might be very, very different than ours.
Wow. So you believe that
I believe that it is in the realm of
it's
possibility.
a
Now, we
possibility?
will know
Hmm.
uh, sometime this century, we will know because we will have built things that are more complex than human brains. And we'll be able to see, assuming that they're not nefarious, right? They could be nefarious and have come, awake and just be biding their time, right? But assuming they're not nefarious, which is we have to do in
Well,
all philosophy.
it's only because we think they're nefarious. I mean, they may look at the human race and say, "What a mistake!
Oh,
Look at this human race. Look what they're doing to this planet. Let's get rid
absolutely.
of
That's
them."
right. Absolutely. Yeah. We, and particularly, the last 100 years, the amount of damage we've done in 100 years of internal combustion engines and pollution and so forth is unconscionable. Our descendants will never forgive us for the way we were profligate in the 20th century. Never. And they should not forgive us. We have been horrible custodians. Sure.
Mm. Oh my gosh!
But when I say this, they're not nefarious. It's one of the fundamental issues in philosophy, right? I believe that you exist. I believe that the world around me exists, but I could
Yeah.
just be a brain in a vat with one other entity feeding me fake inputs for a nefarious purpose so that I would think
Yeah.
that there's existential dread about whether climate change or Vladimir Putin are going to
Yeah.
blow up the world, right? All of that could be
Right.
meaningless. It could be a completely
Yeah.
different reality. So, we take as a given, because nothing else is possible in terms of thinking, that what we perceive actually is reality. But that's up for debate too.
Okay. So that it brings me then to your next book.
Yes.
Yeah, because so I went to your website and I didn't know that you had a new book that is ready to be released. It sounds amazing. So I want you to tell us about it.
Thank you. It was my COVID project. People had different projects.
Ah,
I was approached by Audible, the big producer of audio books on what used to be called books on tape. And they asked me, for your next project, can we have a 6-month window in advance of it coming out in print? And I go, oh, I don't know about that. For an awful lot of money, I go, I'm in. All right, let's do this thing.
something's never changed.
That's right. That's right. Yes. So we, well, whatever you want to write. They said, we want to be in business with Rob Sawyer. We don't, and I said,
Okay.
well, okay. I'm grappling, as I think everybody is, with how the world has changed because of COVID-19. And we've all kind of been living uploaded lives, virtual lives during this pandemic. And at some point, now I was naive and optimistic a year ago when I started this. At some point, this will be over and we'll have to go back to a physicality. But we will have changed, right? And of course,
Right.
science fiction has many definitions, but one of my favorites is it's the genre of metaphor. When you're talking about something in science fiction, you're never talking about the thing it appears to be about. It's always metaphorically about something else. So the downloaded is about human beings who have uploaded into virtual existence, they think, for good. And then a glitch in the system happens and they're forced to decant back into biological existence and learn to live and work together again, which of course is very much, I think, we all hope will happen to us.
Yeah, I love it. Do you know what? It reminds me, I went to an event the other night. It was a dinner with about 16 people, and I haven't really done that in a while. And I noticed that I laughed too loudly. I talked too loudly. All my senses were like just on fire. And afterwards, when I was coming home, I thought, wow, what was that? Why was I behaving in that manner? And I wonder if it's because it's been almost 3 years that I
Absolutely.
haven't been I was fairly, you're talking closely to all these people. You haven't seen these people in 3 years.
Yes, I think one of my favorite movies and the novel is The Maltese Falcon. And Casper Gutman, the Sidney Greenstreet character, says, I like a man who likes to talk. Talking is something you have to do regularly if you're going to do it judiciously. We've fallen out of the habit of talking face to face to somebody. We've fallen out of the habit of occupying physically close spaces with somebody, and we're out of practice. So that's huge part of, I think, what you were going through there. But there's also, many of us, and I'm an extrovert, and I know you're an extrovert, but even extroverts have pent up inside them, or maybe specifically extroverts have pent up inside them so much enthusiasm for interacting face to face. Like everything is bigger and more dramatic because you haven't been doing it.
That's exactly the way I was,
yeah.
Rob.
I know exactly how that feels. I think that's a common enough occurrence.
Let me just end off and ask you then, any big plans or any hopes or dreams for 2023 for you?
For 2023, I am guest of honor at the World Science Fiction Convention, which is a career capstone
Oh,
event. For the
wow.
first
Lovely.
time ever, the World Science Fiction Convention is taking place in Asia. It's going to be in Chengdu, China. I'm hoping that I get to go physically to Chengdu, China. Right now, as we're
Yeah.
talking, Beijing has just gone into lockdown because of COVID outbreaks. Uh, uh, the Chinese government under Xi has had this zero tolerance policy. And I am just hoping that, as I say, I don't know if we're ever going to be completely done with COVID, but I would like to see it being in abeyance long enough that in the summer of 2023, I can go and be the guest of honor at the 81st World Science Fiction Convention.
Wow.
Thank
Congratulations.
you.
Yes, what an
It
honor and
is.
well deserved. And I hope you get to go,
I hope
Rob.
so too.
And you know what this means, right? Now that you've made further predictions, well, you just have to come back again
I would
in a
love to
year.
do that
But
anytime,
this
Mary.
is like a cycle. Okay. Thanks so much,
My
Rob.
pleasure. Thank you.
That's Rob Sawyer, one of Canada's most popular and prolific science fiction writers, and he's releasing a new book, his 25th, called The Downloaded, which will be available on Audible in March of 2023, and the print version will be out in the fall of that year. For more info on Rob and his work, please check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support, and thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.